Okay, so um, okay, Ada, I'm not. Did you just turn on your whiteboard? How did you do that? Oops. Yeah. All right. I want to share my screen, and I want to start with today's letter. Okay. Okay. So this is the letter Tet. Some people pronounce it Teth. It's the difference between the Sephardi pronunciation and the Ashkenazi pronunciation. So in Hebrew, in Israel, we say Tet, and people with a more Yiddish or Ashkenazi background will say Tes. But in any case, the pronunciation of the letter is the same. The numerical value of this letter is 9, which you'll notice because, Kim, we've been doing one letter a week and encouraging people to look at a Hebrew text from week to week to point out the letters. So instead of overwhelming people with letter recognition, you can gradually become familiar with the Hebrew alphabet. If you already know this, it takes a couple of minutes. We'll move on. So this letter Tes, and I gave it to Tet. I gave it to you in 2 different fonts. Is characterized by this opening at the top and a an and a I don't know where my English went. Like a vessel or a holding place in the middle, in the belly, so to speak. The word tov, which is a word you may even know, begins with the letter tet, and it is part of lots of words that we use in Hebrew, lots of expressions, some of which you may know when we're greeting somebody, like Boker Tov means good morning, Erev Tov means good evening, Lila Tov means good night. Like when when your kids won't go to sleep and you put them to bed for 17 times, and then you finally say Lila Tov, Shavua Tov, which is a greeting that we use after Shabbat is over, because starting from sundown after Shabbat, sundown Saturday night, it is a new week. And so Shavua Tov, have a good week. And Chodesh Tov, which means have a good month, which we just had. Yesterday was the first day of the Hebrew month of Adar Bet, of the second Adar, because this is a what's it called, a Shana Meuberet. It's a pregnant year. It's a leap year, is how we say it in English. So here's 2 ideas: that the shape of a tet, I said, is like a vessel containing goodness. And one of the ways that it is described is it is like a woman's womb that is hiding or holding the goodness of an unborn child. And it is also, if you can kind of imagine this as an illustration of a person praying with their head bent. Last week, I think it was, I think it was last week when I showed you that in a lot of synagogues in Hebrew is written, know before whom you stand. And so the idea is that this leg represents God, and this represents the person praying with the head bent. Okay, that is the letter Tet. And okay, and now we are back to the topic of tonight, which before I start, I want to tell you a story. Some of you may know this name, especially if you read 10 from the Nations, which is my first book. There's this man named Dean Bai. He's Canadian. And when I first met him, he told me this story, that he wanted to know, what does the Torah have to say to him as a non-Jew? And so he went through all of Tanakh, all of Hebrew scriptures, with like a yellow highlighter. The way he said he was an actor in his previous life, and it was as if, if any of you have this experience, I don't know if you do, if you're an actor and you get a script and you're playing the part of I don't know, Melanie. Okay, so you go through the script and you highlight all of the lines that are associated with Melanie, because that's your part. Okay, so he wanted to understand, what is his part. And a lot of Jews in particular, when we study when we study Tanakh, we are not always sensitive to or aware of how often Tanakh mentions the rest of the world. And so there is a theme. We see it a lot in Sefer Tehillim. We're going to go through a lot of verses. If you want to, I'm going to read them for you in English, but if you want to get a Bible now, would be a good time to do it. I should have told you in advance, but the theme that I want to highlight is the eventual universal recognition of the God of Israel that appears over and over and over again in Hebrew scriptures and also in Jewish prayer. Okay, so tonight we're going to look at some, not all, but a lot of sources that amplify this idea. So what's the idea? The idea is that Tanakh was never disguised the goal that the entire world would come to a recognition of God. Okay, and I'm not going to say every single verse all through Tanakh, but I'm going to point many of these you'll be familiar with, but I'm trying to make the case that the universal worship of the God of Israel has always been a Torah intention, even though the Jewish people have separated ourselves from the nations, at least for the last 2,000 years, and we've forgotten this message, but it is plainly there, okay? And it is a messianic vision. It is an idea that at the end of days, that the entire world will recognize, will worship, will obey the God of Israel. Now, I'm going to be reading these verses in English, but I want to tell you, and I'll tell you where it's different, that different terms in Hebrew are used to refer to nations or peoples. So I'll tell you what the actual word is in Hebrew when it is referring to a group of people who are not from the Israelite nation. Okay, so the first place that we want to look is in the book of Malachim Aleph, which you probably know as First Kings, chapter 8, verses 41 to 43. And here's it's a more of a lengthy passage than most of the others, but here's how it reads. As for the foreigner, and here it's referring to Hanachri, who does not belong to your people Israel, but who has come from a distant land because of your name, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm when they come and pray toward this temple. Okay, this is the inauguration of the first temple. Then hear from heaven your dwelling place. Do what the foreigner, Hanachri, asks of you, so that all the people of the earth, in Hebrew the words are Amei Haaretz, which is literally people of the earth, may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. So here we have Shlomo HaMelech. We have King Solomon dedicating the first Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, and its Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. And he's specifically asking God to answer the prayers of the foreigners, that is the non-Israelites, that are going to come to this temple to pray. Both temples were built with non-Jewish assistance. Okay, in the case of the first temple, we have Hiram, who offered Shlomo Melech, who offered King Solomon material assistance. The second temple was built with the help of Koresh, of Cyrus, who was the ruler of Persia. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the righteous non-Jews of the world are going to be part of the third temple, whatever that means. So right now, some of you who have been to Israel, you may have heard of the Temple Institute, which is a, by the way, congratulations to all of you who figured out the time situation and are here together with us. Okay, so the Temple Institute, which from what I understand has quite a lot of financial support, is preparing in a physical way for the third temple. So they do things like they rebuild the vessels that Tanakh mentions will be necessary and will be used in the third temple. They invite in people, Jewish men who are from the priestly class, the Kohanim, and they take their measurements and they sew garments for them that they will need in service in the third temple. So, and I believe that they have a fair amount of financial support from the non-Jewish world. The involvement of non-Jews emphasizes that the holy temples in Jerusalem were never intended for the exclusive use of Jews from the first temple, and it will certainly be true in the third temple. Yeshayahu, Isaiah himself, reminds us that and you see Yeshayahu, Isaiah chapter 56, verse 7, that the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was always intended to be, is a very famous line, a house of prayer for all nations. When we lived in Baltimore, my husband was on the rabbinic staff of a synagogue, which was called, in sort of twangy English, Beth Tefillah, Beit Tefillah, which means a house of prayer. And in the synagogue was this verse from Isaiah, a house of prayer for all nations. So it has always been it's a goal of Hashem's running the world, that this is where we're going. But we don't see it right now because we don't have this house of prayer. Okay, let's move to Isaiah, Yeshayahu, chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. Okay, Kathy asks, is there going to be animal sacrifice in the third temple? That is an excellent question, and I will tell you there are two opinions. Okay, one is yes, there will be, and the other is no, there won't be. So I am of the opinion that there will not be, because that there will be some kind of sacrificial system, but that it won't be life. Like it will be, for example, there's a flour and oil kind of sacrifice. It makes sense to me if we're living in a time in the Messianic era where animals are no longer carnivorous. They're not killing each other for food, the lion lying down with the lamb, that whole thing. And people are no longer eating animals, because that's part of how I understand the Messianic vision. Then it doesn't make sense to me that we would be sacrificing animals at the temple, that whatever the ritual service will be will not include killing animals. But there are people who say that it will, or that some of it will. So I don't know. Stay tuned. Okay. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. And it shall be at the end of days. Notice how we have a theme here, that these things are pointing to Brittany asked about the red heifer. So because it's in the news, I'm just going to stop. We are going to get back to your show. I'm just going to stop and answer this question a little bit. And that is that the red heifer is not a perpetual sacrifice. It is like kind of as I understand, I'm not the world's biggest expert, but it is like a one-off thing in order to get ash to ameliorate a certain spiritual condition that is necessary. But there's a question of whether that's
to purify. Yeah, to purify. Right.
But that need may not be an ongoing need. There are a lot of people who are very excited about periodically an animal that they think is a pure red heifer shows up in the world, and there's a new story like that they were brought, I think, from Texas, if I'm not mistaken, to Israel, and they're very carefully guarded in the event that we're going to need them. But remember we talked about many weeks ago that the Messianic era is a process that happens over time. And so things that happen at the very beginning, like maybe the answer to Kathy is also like this: there will be animal sacrifice in the very beginning, but we will wean away from them, if that makes sense. There will be the necessity to purify people with the ash of the red heifer in the very beginning, but we will wean away from that. That makes sense to me, but I don't know for sure. Okay, getting back to Yeshayahu. And it shall be at the end of days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be firmly established at the top of the mountains, and it shall be raised above the hills, and all the nations, in this case the word for nations is goyim, shall stream to it. And many peoples, in this case the Hebrew word is amim, shall go, and they shall say, come, let us go up to the Lord's mount, to the house of God of Jacob, and let him teach us of his ways, and we will go in his paths. For out of Zion shall come forth, out of Zion shall the Torah come forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. That is a very famous song. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah u'devar Hashem miYerushalayim. And if I had a better voice, I would sing it for you. But it's a very, I don't even know if Jews understand that what they're saying is that eventually the whole world is going to be studying the Torah that comes forth from Jerusalem. And in a very small way, that's what we're doing. That's what Zoom technology allows us to do. I'm sitting in Efrat, which is a few miles south of Jerusalem, and you guys are all over the world. And from this place, the Zoom technology and the internet allows Torah to go to New Zealand and to Germany and to, I'm trying to think of all the places where, South Africa, all the places where you guys are, the US. And so let's just look at this. The words at the end of days in this verse is a reference to a time when evil won't exist anymore. And the Vilna Gaon suggests that the streaming that it's referring to will be literal. That is, people who live outside of Israel will stream to the temple across waterways by boat. You may have heard that there's a prophecy that there will be a river coming from the Temple Mount. Alternately, the stream may be some kind of spiritual light that goes out from the temple and is somehow so strong that it's going to attract the attention of the nations, of people who are living geographically very far from where the temple is. But somebody once suggested to me in a very cute way that streaming means like exactly what we're doing, right? Like streaming online, and that only became clear, in the last 10 years or 15 years or whatever. Okay. The teacher of the nations in this verse is either a reference to God himself or to Mashiach, who's going to teach God's ways to people from the nations. And the nations are going to want to come and visit the temple because they will understand that that is the source of moral instruction. Okay. So we're speaking about a time after the Messianic Redeemer is in the world, and whoever survives will have survived and will be drawn to, like magnetically drawn to the third temple, in order to experience as closely as humanly possible this light, this aura, this spiritual gift that is emanating from Jerusalem. And the Jewish people, many of whom at this point don't really know this yet, will be kind of like the local hosts, right? This will be something that we will welcome people from the nations. We will orient them to how things work around here and how to worship God from this holy place. So I want to just tell you the story because there's controversy. How many of you, but just raise your hand if you've ever been on the Temple Mount. How many of you have ever? 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. A few of you have. I have also. It's very controversial in Jewish circles to ascend the Temple Mount at this time in history. And so some people, Jewish people, will not go. In fact, I think if you go there, there's a big sign that says it's forbidden for Jews to go there. But nevertheless, there's a different philosophy, another approach. And some people believe that it is not only not forbidden, but that we should, although Jews are restricted to only certain places on the Temple Mount. So one time, my husband and I were going, and there's all this spiritual preparation you have to do. And this was some year, maybe 10 years ago. So I think things are a little easier now. But this is what I remember, is that there were two lines. If you were Jewish, AKA Israeli, you had to go in one line. And if you were from the nations, if you were just like a tourist, you went on another line that was kind of like had a turnstile, and people were just like a line at Disney World or something, and people would just go, and then they would go do whatever they wanted on the mountain. And the Israelis were subjected to a much different scenario. So we had to turn in our passports. We had to wait for like an hour because I don't know, they had to do like some kind of security clearance on us. We had to leave behind like they checked our packs, whatever we were carrying. We had to leave behind anything with any religious significance. And we went with a rabbinic guide who told us where to walk and so forth. But so the point is that the way it is now, and I do believe that it's a little better. It's easier for Jews, aka Israelis, to get onto the Temple Mount today, and there are people pushing the envelope. But at the time we went, it was very challenging, very hard. So that's because we're not in the Messianic era in its fullness yet. But in that period of time, we know that all the negative stuff, the hatred, the fighting, the jealousy, the competition, false beliefs, none of that stuff is going to exist. And everybody will know God and will spend their time studying his word, studying the new Torah. This is what we believe, the new Torah that Mashiach will reveal, and being connected to Hashem. And part of that is the experience of connecting with the temple, the third temple on the Temple Mountain. Okay. Let's move on to Yeshayahu, Isaiah chapter 49, verse 6. This is God talking. God's talking to Yeshayahu. And he said, is it too light for you to be my servant, to establish the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the besieged of Israel? But I will make you a light of nations so that my salvation shall be until the end of the earth. So in this verse, God is speaking to Yeshayahu, and he's reminding him of his mission, which includes sharing these prophetic messages both with the Jewish people and with the nations. So it is the job of the nation of Israel to show the rest of the world, or to share what I call the universal wisdom of Torah. You've heard me use that expression. How God runs the world, and those of his laws that apply to all of humanity. That's what I'm doing with you. That's what, for those of you that are involved with the fellowship, I think that's what they call it, the fellowship that Jeremy Gimpel and Ari Abramowitz, Laura, I know that you're involved, and maybe there are others of you that have seen clips of what they do when they are speaking. Even Rabbi Alona Nava, who teaches from Tzfat, when Jewish teachers are speaking to the nations, that's what we're doing. That what we're doing is sharing not how to be a Jew. That's not relevant here. But what does God have to say to people? God doesn't want the whole world to be Jewish. That's never, it's not any kind of goal. But God does want the whole world to live by certain moral codes, to worship him. And to that extent, that's what he's charging Yeshayahu with. Okay, let's move on. Yeshayahu, Isaiah chapter 56, verses 6 through 7. Here he's speaking about the foreigners, Hanechar, who join with the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, everyone who observed the Sabbath from profaning it and who holds fast to my covenant. I will bring them to my holy mount, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Again, we've seen that verse before. So after the coming of Mashiach, Jews and Gentiles, as we've talked about, will both come to Jerusalem to pray at the third temple and to do some kind of sacrificial service, whether it's flour and oil or a lamb or whatever it's going to be. These words, by the way, are part of the liturgy, the prayer service that Jews say on Yom Kippur. And we're literally praying for this to come true, that we're praying that a time will come when people from the nations will come to Jerusalem, will do whatever it is that is being done at the third temple out of a desire to worship the God of Israel, and that the Jews will welcome them. So not just a verse that's hidden somewhere in the book of Isaiah, it is literally a prescription for what the relationship is supposed to be, in part, between the Jewish people in the land of Israel and the rest of the world. Okay. One more verse from Yeshayahu chapter 60, verse 3. and the nations shall go by your light, and kings by the brilliance of your shine. So again, we talked about this idea of the third temple having some kind of magnetic light that draws spiritually inclined people, or people who survive whatever the turbulence will be at the end of days, that they will be drawn to the spiritual light that shines from the Torah, that shines from Jerusalem, that shines from the temple, that shines from the Messianic Redeemer. And that is going to be the vehicle. So, so right now, a lot of you, if you have not yet been to Israel, it's probably something that you desire to do or have thought about doing, but many of you have already been here, and that light isn't even shining in all of its strength. Imagine a time when Jerusalem will be so pure and so godly that the souls of people all over the world will be lit up in a excuse me, and attracted to and want to become closer to that light. That's the way that I understand the vision. I think on some level, if you're here with me now, that's something you already feel. You already get that. You are drawn in some way to something. You may not understand what is pulling you, and it's certainly right now a much weaker influence, but if it's already influencing you to make choices to be here together with me, yes, Laura says we are scattered sparks of light out there in the darkness. Exactly. But imagine when that gets multiplied. You guys in your communities, in your spheres of influence, because you can reach people that I can't reach, you're going to be like the leaders because you already understand this dynamic in some sense. But in the future, it will be more universal. That's how I understand it. Okay, let's move to the book of Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah, chapter 23, verses 7 and 8. Therefore, all you see, by the way, that all of these verses have this messianic geula kind of an association. Therefore, behold, days are coming, says the Lord, well, they shall no longer say, as the Lord lives, who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the seed of the house of Israel from the northland and from all the lands where I have driven them, and they shall dwell on their land. So first, I want to say that in Jewish life, we have many, many, many times when we are commanded to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Certainly, you know to associate that with Passover, but it's not only in Passover; it's all the time, because to date, that's sort of the best thing that God has ever done for us, and we constantly remind ourselves and remind our children of that redemption. But that redemption will pale in comparison to when God returns all of his people from all over the world. Okay, so I'm going to touch on this idea of the ultimate reunification of the 12 tribes. Okay, the house of Israel from the Northland can be understood to be the lost tribes of the Northern Kingdom. This is a very controversial topic, by the way, and maybe we'll go into it in more detail in a future class if some of you are interested in this. But it's important that Jewish people understand, even if we don't know exactly how it's going to play out, that this reunification is considered a part of the process of Geula, that God is going to, the way we usually understand it, you may have heard this expression called kibbutz galiot, which means the ingathering of the exiles is how it's said in English. The ingathering of the exiles, most Jews think mean like the Jews in New York and the Jews in South Africa and the Jews in the UK are all going to come back to live in Israel. But there's a deeper idea that there's remnants of more tribes that have to be reunified for the entire house of Israel to be complete. How that's going to play out, I have no idea. It's not a universally accepted understanding, but there are those who believe that many of the non-Jews who feel drawn to Torah in our day, I'm talking about like you guys, contemporary, may be spiritual, if not physical descendants of the 10 tribes. in my book, Lighting Up the Nations, there's a whole chapter called Rachel Weeps for Her Children, The Return of the 10 Tribes by Anarina Kreisman, which it's a kind of a lengthy chapter, but it's way, way more on this theme. If it's of interest to you, I could teach it to you, or we could talk about it. But a lot of people who have these feelings do you may have done this yourself. I don't know if any of you have, but they'll do DNA tests to see is there any like Jewish blood that could describe what their attraction is. Now, I would say to you, based on the verses that we've seen so far, one need not be physically descended from the 10 tribes in order to feel drawn to the spiritual light of Jerusalem. Because as we described, right now it's very it's a fraction of what it will be in the future, but it could be that your instrument is more finely tuned and you're getting it kind of earlier in the game. We are in a process, and you are already where the rest of the world needs to get to one extent or another, just by virtue of the fact that each week you come and you join me here to study Torah from Jerusalem, to visit Israel, to support Israel, right? You're in a different class. I don't mean literally class, but you're in a different category than most of the world is. But that's where you are, you will advance, and most of the world will advance maybe to where you are. So everybody kind of goes up a level. In fact, I might have shared this idea with you that that I learned this concept that the physical third temple will eventually it will be built on the Temple Mount in the land of Israel, in the center of Jerusalem, but that eventually the Jews will give it over to the nations. That the Jews will have some other access to worshiping God, and the nations will inherit the third temple, the physical third temple. I don't know exactly more to say about that, but the idea is that all of us are in a process that is playing out in the world right now, that the Nevi'im, the prophets of the Bible, have already told us about. And if you're already on that page, you are way ahead of and you are already on that page, obviously, because you're here with me. So you are already like way ahead of most of the rest of the world. Let's go on to Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 9. 9 through 11. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare it on the islands from afar, and say, he who scattered Israel will gather them together and watch them as a shepherd his flock. For the Lord has redeemed Jacob and saved him out of the hand of him who is stronger than he. And they shall come and jubilate on the height of Zion. That is, of course, a reference to the Temple Mount. They will stream to the goodness of the Lord over corn, wine, and oil, and over sheep and cattle. And their souls shall be like a well-watered garden, and they shall have no further worry at all. Again, a messianic vision. The nations are going to recognize God's hand in redeeming the Jewish people, and they will come and celebrate with us. So, so Yirmiyah was talking about a time when kind of like what I think we did chapter 126 of Psalms. Brittany, I'm glad this is touching you. That the chapter 126 of Psalms talks about how the nations will first the nations will recognize the good that God has done for the Jewish people, and then the Jewish people will, as a result of it having been pointed out to us by the nations, will agree, yes, God has done great things for us. So there's, in all of these verses and in all of this messianic vision that I'm playing out for you, there's this relationship between the nation of Israel and the rest of the world. It was never meant, as I'm plainly demonstrating, it was never meant that we were in totally separate spheres, right? Because God is the God of the whole world. Shabbat is Shabbat for the whole world. The Torah is the Torah for the whole world. And there might be applications of it that differ from one group to another, but the universality of it is a new it's a new understanding, both for people who come from Christian background and from people who come from Jewish background, because not a lot of people have been talking about this for the last 2,000 years. Okay. Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, chapter 31, verse 33. By the way, if you're looking in a Christian translation, and I don't know which books are like that, there are some slight changes in the numbers, but hopefully you're able to follow along with me, or you're looking at a Jewish translation, so it's an exact match. And no longer shall one teach his neighbor, or shall one teach his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the smallest to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will no longer remember. So when Mashiach ben David, specifically the final Redeemer, comes into the world, he will teach the what's called the Panemius, which is the inner hidden dimension of Torah, and everybody, Jew and Gentile, will be able to connect to God directly through these teachings. So one of the really strong memories that I have, this was about maybe 7 years ago or so. I learned this from Rabbi Alona Nava, who is one of the teachers that I follow, who's based in Sfat. And he said, all of the Torah that we have right now is only part of the story. And I might have shared that idea with you before, that the Messiah has sort of the rest of the story, the rest of the Torah, that is the hidden dimension. And part of his job will be to teach that Torah to the entire world. And what Rabbi Anava said that was so striking to me was, he said it will make the Torah that we have now feel like Hevel. Now, Hevel is a Hebrew word that literally means like mist, meaning as much as, and I don't remember who it was that I was texting with this week about, no matter, you could spend all your life, all the time that you have in your lifetime studying Torah and never master it. It isn't like learning algebra, right? Which is like a finite kind of set of information and then you master it, or learning Spanish or whatever. Torah is something that is endless. But that's only the Torah that we have. The piece that we don't yet have, that will be revealed to us in the future, in Messianic days. Yes, Natalie, like vapor. What did I say? The
Mist.
what were mist, vapor, like something that doesn't really have any substance. It will make the Torah that we have now, for as many, I'm sitting in my library and I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like 10 bookshelves filled with books of Torah. And that's hardly even scratches the surface of what's available now. You can imagine what's going to be accessible in the future when the Messianic Redeemer teaches us the rest of the Torah. Okay, let's jump ahead to Tzfanya, which I think you might know as Zephaniah. I'm not sure. I really want to pay attention to your. Okay, Kim wrote, when I was returning to Tamar, that's a city, a town, a village in the Negev during Sukkot. The bus stopped at Rachel's 2 months, some high holy day. I did not know where we were going, only knew that I was crying. When I went into the building, I was weeping with tears rolling down my face uncontrollably, like I had never before. When I returned to the bus, I asked a woman why I was weeping, and she shared with me how Rachel weeps for the nations. Then I knew my heart has always been for all of the people of the nations. This is what I think physics, so beautifully said, Kim, that physically being in the land of Israel touches people in a way that is like inexplicable, because it's something in the air here that something in the air here that something spiritual that people can access. Okay, Sfanya, let's go on. Chapter 3, verse 9. There's a very famous verse. You might have heard this. For then I will convert the peoples to a pure language, for all of them to call in the name of the Lord, to worship Hashem, to worship him of one accord. And of course, that language is Hebrew, right? So one way of understanding this verse is that in order to be able to express spiritual reality, you need Hebrew language skills. Okay, that all the people, this is something I can't wait for. If this is true, that all the people will speak Hebrew in the Messianic age, so that they can call out to God in the most proper and accurate way, using the Holy Tongue. And somehow this is going to happen in some miraculous way, where we won't have to spend years and years in Ulpan. But God will make make it Hebrew accessible to us in order for us to accomplish spiritually what we need to accomplish spiritually. Let's move on because I have a lot more. I'm probably not going to finish all of the verses, but I think that you can see that the case that I'm building is that what we have to look forward to in the Messianic era um, includes all of the people of the world who are spiritual people who have a desire to connect with God, who have access to Jerusalem in whatever way. Okay, Zechariah, chapter 8, verse 23. This is a very famous verse. And yeah, Kelly, me too. I also would like to get that download so I could be completely fluent. Okay. So said the Lord of hosts, in those days when 10 men of the languages of the nations shall take hold of the skirt. Skirt is a very bad translation, but it's the corner of a garment of a Jew. You all probably know this, saying, "Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." According to Rashi, who is like the most important commentator on the Torah and the Talmud, who lived in the late 11th century, there will be, listen to this math, 10 men from each of the 70 nations, it's 700 people, clinging to the corner of a talit, of a prayer shawl, which we know has 4 corners. So the idea is that each Jew will attract the attention of 2,800. That's 10 men or 10 people from 70 nations times 4 corners of God-fearing non-Jews. Okay. And that verse gives me and the Jewish ought to give the Jewish people some idea of the awesome responsibility that we have to to share the universal wisdom of Torah, who God really is, what He wants from them, the kind of work that we're doing together. It's stated in masculine language, but I don't think that's yeah. So Laura is reminding us that there's a group that used to be called the Nation's Ninth of Av that adopted this 10 from the Nations, which is also the name of my first book, coming from this verse. So I I study in another part of my life. I study with this young Chinese woman. I don't know if I've ever told you about her. And she comes from a culture where, so she's studying Judaism. She comes from a culture where there's no religion. So there's no God, no sense of godness, nothing. And that she doesn't have to change she doesn't have to change what she believes in she does have to change what she believes in because I've introduced her to the concept of God and so forth. But the idea is that some of these people, there's 2 ideas. Some of these people will come from nations that have no spiritual foundation to speak of. Okay. And it's going to surprise them a whole lot more than it's going to surprise anybody that grew up Christian, that there is a God in the world. That's not going to surprise anybody who grew up a Christian. But a whole lot of people are going to be very surprised when they find out that the world is not just Hefker, which means like without any rules or like that. But the other thing I wanted to say is that apparently at some time in history there were approximately the same number of Chinese people as there were Jewish people. I don't remember the numbers. I don't remember the exact. I think I learned this from Rabbi Mendel Kessen, but basically the notes are on there. I don't want to take time to say it to you, but I mean to look it up. But here's basically the idea: because of the persecution of Jews, the number of Jews today in the world is approximately 15 or 16 million, as we understand, in the entire world. Okay, if we started out blobs of, let's say, 2,000, 3,000 years ago with the same number as there were of Chinese, and now there are, well, I don't know the exact number, but like billions of Chinese people in the world, God is clearly, I think, keeping the Jewish people, usually through unpleasant means of persecution, to a very modest number. It's not coincidental that, number one, the Jewish people we don't try to it is possible to convert, but we don't try to convert people. But the Jewish people are a very modest number of people. And yet God has said, that's our job. That's what the way that I understand Light to the Nations means. There's a lot of other people in the world, way, way, way more than we the Jewish people are as a nation. And yet, if you think about like a third grade class, there's, let's say, one teacher and 20 kids. I'm making up the proportion. Okay. So if we as Jewish people understand our role properly, it only makes sense that there's more people of the nations. Anyway, I've made my point. I want to go on. Okay. Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 10. And he shall speak peace to the nations, and his rule shall be from the sea to the west and from the river to the ends of the earth. It's interesting. You know that really disgusting political slogan, from the river to the sea? I said, I didn't notice that before, but both are mentioned in this verse. That Mashiach is going to communicate with the nations, and his rule will be over the entire world. He'll be based in Jerusalem, but there's a kind of a sense in the messianic vision is a unity. It's not like it is now, where the whole world is divided and into different countries. And if you think about, so Purim is coming up, and if you think of the Purim story, that King Achashverosh ruled over 127 provinces, okay, each with its own language and so forth. And in this part of the world where I am, there were empires. We don't really live like that anymore, because now we have individual countries with individual borders and so forth. But imagine a time when we don't have individual borders and individual governments and all that. We just have the messianic ruler speaking to the entire world from Jerusalem. That's the unity of the messianic vision. Okay. Zechariah, and the Lord, let me give you the verse. Hang on. Chapter 14, verse 9. And the Lord shall become king over all the earth. On that day shall the Lord be one, and his name one. I think, Natalie, in the comments, you mentioned the word echad. This is one of the places where we see that eventually God's kingship will be universally recognized by whoever survives until the end of days. One of my...
And also in Zephaniah.
Where?
In Zephaniah. In the verse that you are giving, 3:9, is Echad, Shem
right.
Echad.
Right. This concept of unity of all, like, we live in a very divisive world, even to the point where not just countries but neighbors who don't necessarily. And Israel seems to be, in my experience, Israel and the Jews seem to be the flashpoint that one of the flashpoints that divides people into camps, right? So it could be two neighbors that literally live right next door to each other that see things very differently. And that's the world that we live in right now. But we're talking about, so one of my other teachers' name is Rabbi Pinchas Winston. This is a quote from him: the goal of history, according to this verse, is the universal recognition of God as king over everything. And he says that means what it sounds like, that there's no more atheism, there's no more agnosticism, all of mankind worshiping one God, the God of the Torah, the God of Israel. And that's the theme of Tanakh. Let me I'll give you, we'll end with a few verses from Tehillim, from the book of Psalms, although there are many, many more, and all of them are in this Lighting Up the Nations, which I'll send you a list of. Psalms chapter 9, verse 12. Sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Relate his deeds among the peoples. So King David HaMelech, and by extension, the rest of the Jewish nation, are urged in this verse to speak about the wonders that God has done for them whenever they interact with people from the nations. So I was talking to somebody this week about miracles. You know, on the one hand, we live in a very, 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 very dark time. And if you're at all connected to social media and you see the kinds of things that people believe and say in the West, particularly about Israel, about the Jewish people, it is worse than it has ever been in our lifetimes. And yet, every time there's a barrage of rockets, right now they're coming, we've dismantled most of Hamas's ability to shoot from the south, but from the north, there's these new Hezbollah rockets that are landing in the Golan or whatever. And whether you understand it in a natural way, like Iron Dome, it shoots, destroys a bunch of them in midair, or they land in empty fields, they're considering the amount of firepower that our enemies have pointed at us and send over, whether from the south or from the north, over the last 20 years or however long it's been. It's extraordinary how relatively little, and I'm not minimizing when it happens, but how relatively little property damage and how there is, and how almost no people are injured. Thank God, thank God, thank God, thank God a million times. That is in the midst of all of the darkness, like a miracle that every time I see a news report, it's not like if you live in Israel, in a place where the sirens go off and you have to run to your safe room. It is scary, like it does make your heart beat and so forth, but practically speaking, the chances of you getting actually injured or killed, God forbid, are really pretty minimal. And that is I can only ascribe, because it's not normal, like it's not natural that if any other country shot this amount of firepower into a neighboring country, like it's clear that that God is protecting us, even while many of us have paid a terrible price. But yeah, it is amazing. Okay, let's do a couple more verses of Tehillim, of the book of Psalms. Chapter 22, verses 28 and 29. All the ends of the earth shall remember and return to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall prostrate themselves before you. So you guys are really already there, but there's going to come a time when the nations will eventually realize that despite our history of degradation, that Hashem will ultimately reward the Jewish people. And when they see that, it will inspire them to turn to God. So we live in a time, this is one way that I sometimes describe it. If the Jewish people were on top of the world, everybody respected us, everybody turned to us, everybody supported us, and so forth, and then Mashiach comes, that's nice, but it's not gonna turn history on its head. If we live in a time, as we do, where a huge chunk of the world is so morally unclear that they think we're the bad guys in this, then the revelation of truth is going to be that much more powerful, because it is, we have this concept of Purim turning everything upside down. That's what we're talking about, is the potential for the Messianic era, is that everything that people thought is going to turn out to be not true, and proven to them that they have totally misread this situation, and that it's exactly because we have been degraded by the nations, and even still God sends a redeemer from the middle of Jerusalem, that to reward the Jewish people. That's what's going to inspire them. Do you hear how it's almost like it's almost like good news that a lot of the world hates us, because it's going to make the redemption, yes, exactly, like Purim, it's going to make the redemption that much stronger. And I'm sorry that I don't, I'm happy that you're engaged and you want to send messages. I don't know how it looks on your screen, but like I only get like 2 or 3 words of people's comments, and then I have to open it and then I get distracted. All right. I think I'll do one more, and then we'll finish up for tonight. This is Tehillim, the book of Psalms, chapter 33, verse 8. Let the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. God created the world, this is me talking now, in such a way that people understand there's aspects of creation that they can't control. We've spoken a number of times about the idea of kochi va'otzem yadi, the spiritual flaw that's in us that makes us think we can fix things. We can do it all ourselves, like a 2-year-old, who says, I do it, me do it, whatever they say. Okay. That nature is a vehicle for us to learn this lesson, that there are some things that are out of our control. And as spiritual people who read Psalms and who love God, we see it, but the whole world doesn't see it. But that's where we're going. That that nature is almost like a tool for that God uses to teach humanity that there are some things you can control. So I'll just end with this story. I remember years ago I was working at the University of Maryland, and I was on campus, and I had to walk to the parking garage where my car was. And it was an extremely, extremely windy day. And I was walking against the wind. And I remember thinking, I had like a spiritual thought about that, because number one, I'm aware that I cannot control the weather, but the wind, it doesn't, you can't actually see anything. You can see the effects of the wind. You can see things blowing around. And I could feel how hard it was for me to advance step by step to get closer to my car because the wind was so strong. But really, that was God. That's one way of understanding it, that was God like announcing himself to me in the wind, because I couldn't control it. I can't see it, but it impacts me. You see what I'm saying? So nature is like a foil for that. Okay, I'm gonna do this. So I don't want to leave your questions completely unanswered, but I'm also aware that I only have 2 minutes left. Brittany asks, speaking about life when Messiah reigns and the nations worship Hashem, will the people who die or enter Geula, old, disabled, etc., will we be young again, be married, or do we live as single creations? It's hard to comprehend life redeemed. Okay, this is how I understand it. There will be no more disease, no more infirmity. There will be, so there's different time periods. So the question is, there isn't a belief in, I haven't researched this, so I don't have a text, but this is what's in my head, that everybody at some point will die and will be immediately reborn. And that the bodies that we come back in will be perfected. So when in the Garden of Eden, and we've talked many times about how everything goes back to the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, the original bodies that Adam and Eve, that Adam and Chava had, were different than the physical bodies that we have now. And God changed the nature of our bodies. So what bodies we're going to have, what will our human relationships be like, and so forth. Again, Geula is a process. So let's say Mashiach comes tomorrow. Tomorrow's Wednesday, right? Mashiach comes tomorrow. I'm not saying that God willing, I'm not saying that all of our bodies will immediately change, but I believe that there is some kind of a more spiritual, physical form that we will take on. But I don't know that age is going to be relevant, or the kind of things that limit us in this world. This is not a great answer because I didn't prepare, but I wanted to say that I think the nature of physical reality will change, and making some of these questions not so relevant. Okay, it is now an hour. I want to be sensitive to anybody who needs to go. There are many, many more verses that are in this chapter in lighting up the nations, but I think you have the point that we see over and over and over and over again, this messianic vision that totally includes the rest of the world, side by side with the Jewish people, and that was the main point that I wanted to leave you with. So if you have to go, thank you for joining me. I appreciate always that you're here. And if you want to stay for a minute, if somebody has something burning that they want to say, I'm happy to stay for a few minutes and try to address it better than I did that last question. Okay, yes, Laura, I see you want to say something.
Yeah, you said this statement that somehow God uses the Jewish people to be like a lightning rod to bring about I don't know, not necessarily division, but you got to choose sides. And so, how that has played out for me in a very dramatic way since the breakout of the war on October the 7th, we've seen a huge increase all over the world of anti Semitism, and sometimes in um, unusual places you wouldn't normally think that you would see it, that was hidden. We obviously see it with the radical extremists, Islam and the Palestinians and Hamas and all that. But personally, I have had to kind of step back and cut off some particular relationships from so-called Christians that have been showing a lot of anti-Semitism. Like I had to basically say, I can't walk with you. I can't go there, can't fellowship with you. I've actually kind of switched congregations. And I was going to a Messianic congregation that meets on Shabbat. And now I'm in alignment with a Sunday fellowship that stands strong with Israel, actually has an outreach and a ministry to the northern border, to the kibbutz up on the border of Lebanon. And they've had that outreach to them for many, many years. And it's like, those are my kind of people. And so, yes, for me personally, the war I've had to end, let me see, like subscriptions to certain news organizations that have shown themselves to be very anti-Semitic in their coverage of the war. So like, I don't want to look at your news anymore. I'm not going to your website anymore. So I've had to really do some shifting and changing in the alignments and associations of who I associate with and who I fellowship with ever since the war broke out.
Yeah, I think you're
And
speaking for a lot of us. I think that there's a lot of us that
yes,
have had to realign relationships on this issue, because this is, I think, the time when God is asking us, pick a team. And
that's
some
right.
people that we might have been very close to, we might have actually loved or whatever, are on what we think as the wrong team. And this is where kind of the rubber meets the road.
And you know what? We're on your team, Rivka. We're on the team of on the Jewish people. I think that's true for all of us here on this call.
It's God's team. I thank you for that. But it's not, like
Yes.
I'm on God's team,
Yes.
you're on God's team. We're all and even though we are not all exactly in the same place on all the nuances as we discussed, I don't know if you were following the thread today, but there was but we are all on that team, on the God team. And
Yes.
I personally, you may have had this thought yourself, like I really well, I should live long enough to see people who are not on the right team either get right with God or suffer the consequences. Like I think I would like to see God do that already. That you probably agree.
Yes.
Anybody else? A last comment before we go? No? Yeah. Natalie, are you waving like you want to say something or just saying goodbye? You need to unmute yourself so I can hear you. Natalie, you're talking, but we can't hear you because you're not unmuted.
Good. Okay.
Okay.
Take a long time to find the thing. I had a very cool thing to say. Like when you're speaking about Jerusalem, like people will be coming close to Jerusalem, like there is a stream and something like that. Like a magnet, okay? Like a magnet. And the name in French, aimant, is a magnet, but aimant is also somebody who love. So the people who love God is like Jerusalem will be a magnet because they love God. And is a cool thing. In French, the two names means magnet and loving God. So I find that just amazing.
That's cool.
Very cool. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I wish you all a good rest of the week, and God willing, we'll see you next week. Bye.